So now we shift from talking about institutions to the other side of the coin, which is identities. Now, these are not totally independent topics because your identity, your individual experience, has been built and shaped by society. Of course, society, which takes its primary structure from the institutions we build, were built up by individuals who have identities, right? So they're interactive. One is not necessarily more powerful than the other. Institutions don't exist without individual identities creating the habitual routines of behavior that they're made up from. But at the same time, no human is socialized in a vacuum, right? We are all, from before we're born, in a web of social relationships, right? We're literally being spoken to in the womb with a variety of socialized cues, tones of voice, gendered ideas, right? When somebody speaks to the stomach of a pregnant woman, sometimes they'll talk differently based on the gender of the baby if they know it. So to talk about identities is not completely separate from talking about institutions. However, we are now focusing more on the individual than on the structures of society as a whole. So first, in social constructivist thought, our identities are the sum total of the roles that we play. Now, this is quite different than what a lot of folks in Western culture might think about, or other cultures than just Western might think about identities and the source of identity. Right. So if you think that there is perhaps an immaterial soul that hosts your identity, well, that's outside the scope of sociology as a social science. If you think there's some kind of internal, true, authentic self deep inside that you can go away and journal and have a silent retreat and reflect and discover who you are apart from your social roles, social constructivism would challenge that. Now, maybe you can go away and reflect on your participation in your place in your social roles, and that can still be helpful and instructive. But consider this possibility. What if your identity, who you are, your sense of self-concept, is the sum total of the interaction of the social roles you play? Right, so think of all the different social roles you play. You might be a mom or a dad or a brother, a sibling. So there's familial roles, a child to a parent, of course. There could be career or professional roles you play, hobby type roles you play. You're a bass guitarist or a soccer player. There could be roles. Around any of the institutions you can think of, you play roles, right? As a customer to certain kinds of stores, as a consumer of certain kinds of entertainment or services. If you add these up and you consider the fact that some of them are more primary in your sense of self than others, you spend more time interacting. Some of them are more important to you, or what we would say is salient to your sense of self, right? How often do you reflect on your gender identity or your sexual identity or your racial identity? Right? We know from lots of social literature that if you are in a privileged position on some identity, you actually probably spend less time thinking about that identity. Because one of the natures of privilege, of any kind that we're talking about, is that you have the opportunity, the privilege, not to think about that identity as much, because it doesn't stand apart from sort of the mainstream culture that you're in. But there's more than just race, class, gender, and some of these dominant identity categories that sociology looks at. There's lots of smaller categories of roles you play that are linked to this. Now, where do these identities come from? They're happening all the time. Every single social interaction you have is building, reinforcing, or slightly evolving a social role, and therefore a piece of your identity. Right? And over time, some of our roles become more or less important. It might be really important that you're a kid to your parent, but then later you move out, you have kids of your own, and now being a parent becomes more important than being the kid to your own parent. And so over the lifespan, these roles might move in their prioritization in your life and how impactful they feel to you. But the sum total of them is who you are. Now, they come from a process that we call socialization. That's just where you take on the norms, values, assumptions, habits, patterns of your society. So everybody is socialized Every human is socialized, but they're socialized differently based on the society they're in, right? Because you're given a different set of roles and role expectations depending on the societal setting that you find yourself growing up in. And this happens in two main stages, though they overlap: primary socialization and secondary socialization. Primary socialization just means it's first, right? It starts from probably before you're born and goes all the way up until you're pretty good at taking on the generalized other, the perspective of others towards you. So most of childhood, all right? And what are the primary socializing agents during this period of primary socialization? I mean, you can guess them, right? It's going to be parents. It's going to probably be your schooling. If you're in a religious family and that's heavily involved in your life, it could be religious leaders or institutions of that sort. But family, school, and religion tend to be some of the most powerful primary socializing agents. Certainly cultural inputs like the kinds of cartoons or videos or content that you're exposed to at a young age. And these start to shape those initial roles you have, your default assumptions about what is normal in a variety of roles and when you interact with a variety of different kinds of institutions. Then there's secondary socialization. So that primarily starts once you can take on the perspective of others towards you, and you start thinking, okay, what are they thinking of me? Cooley talks about the looking glass self, and the idea is that your identity is shaped heavily not just by what others think about you or what you think about yourself, but what you think others think about you, whether you're accurate or not in that assumption. That begins to shape how we behave, how we perform. Secondary socialization, it might come from later levels of schooling. It might come from new friend groups or romantic partners, additional mass media that you consume, but also broader institutions. Your profession or career that you start moving towards. That professionalization is a big piece of socialization. Maybe you join the military, and then that becomes an institution that shapes your identity in a profound way. Economic institutions, political institutions. Now we're getting into the kind of macro level societal institutions beyond some of those real more personal primary ones of family, religion, education. It's also very hard to overstate the fundamental role that language plays in this process. The language you're raised with doesn't just give you a vocabulary to talk about your internal experience. It actually structures the way you think about things. Words are pathways of thought, right? And so when you are speaking a language, the broader the vocabulary you have, the more capacity you have for abstract thought, right? So take an example I like to use is the word ambivalence. Right? So this is a word where you're not really sure what to do about a situation because you have conflicted feelings. Now, you might feel something similar to that, but without knowing the word ambivalence, it's hard to have a more complex experience of that emotion, right? So you might think in some really base emotional patterns if you don't have language at all, right? You'll still feel anger, sadness, some basic drives like hunger or something like that. But it's difficult to think about the stock market and your anxiety, ambivalence of what to invest in, right? Without language, without learning that there are signs representing complex things. And so it's no wonder that based on the subculture, there are more words for things they encounter more frequently in their day-to-day life, right? So if you live in a snowy climate, the languages there tend to have more words for snow. And so it gives you the ability to express yourself more complexly and actually to think. I'm not going to argue that language facilitates all thinking, but language certainly facilitates the ability for more complex thought. And so lastly, with this idea of identity, if there were some kind of, almost like self-help message in social construction, which certainly this course is not intended as a self-help course, but when we talk about identity, these are things very personal to each of us. The argument is, don't try to uncover who you are, right? If you're having an identity crisis or an identity struggle, you don't find that simply by looking deep inside and wondering if there's something underneath all the social roles, underneath all the masks, if you will, right? This idea of authenticity, that if you take off all your masks, you're left with this true self underneath. And social constructivism argues, well, what if it's the collection of masks you have that is your identity? Like, that is your character, the sum of the characters you play, right? In this play called life, right? Or the idea of take an onion. If you peel back all of its layers, you don't find a core or a pit. The substance of the onion is in its layers. So if there is a message of identity formation or transformation from the constructivist standpoint, it would be pay attention to the layers, pay attention to the roles, the masks that you wear, right? So look at name as many of the social roles you can identify that you play, and then try to rank them, try to figure out which ones are more important or salient to your core identity. And if there are some things you want to change, see if you can't edit that hierarchy, right? Are there some roles you can delete? Maybe you don't like that employment status and you can just quit that job. Now, some are harder. You can't just quit being a parent, or I guess you could abandon your kids, right? But that might not be recommended. But you might be able to edit the time you spend on certain things, right? Maybe you think you work too much, even though it's important to you, and it takes away from your family life or some of your other passions or hobbies. So you come up with ways to dial that identity down a little bit. Or you think you do a good job in this family setting and playing this role of kid, but maybe you're, or as grandchild say, but your grandparents are getting older and you're not sure how much time they have left. And you decide you're going to dial that relationship up a little bit. You're still playing a role, and you're intentionally choosing to intensify how you play that role or to play it slightly differently. The constructivist argument is that that is literally how you change identity. That it's not super mystical and abstract. It doesn't take long walks on the beach and deep inner reflection so much as it takes just the recognition that here are the roles, how important is each role, and how might I edit how I play those roles. And once you do that, you've worked on identity work. You've changed your sense of self, and ultimately, that's all that identity is, the sum total of how you perform your social roles.